Good evening. I would like to reopen the Tuesday, December 17, 2024 Housing and Redevelopment Authority meeting. This will be concurrent with the Planning Commission this evening.
If I may, Chair. I would like to officially open the meeting of the Bloomington Planning Commission as well. Thank you.
Oh, hi, thank you. Nick Johnson, Planning Supervisor.
Hello. Okay. Good evening. I'm Emily Hesbeck, and I am a planner.
Thank you, Mary Cruz. Is it possible to share the slide deck? So yeah, thank you all for coming here. It's always cool when multiple boards and commissions can come together and connect and get to know one another and talk about various policy questions that intersect with both of your responsibilities. So tonight, this evening, we'll present a first rough draft of our co-living SRO standards. So the planning staff have been before you once before, and in a more informal study session, we'll kind of talk about what the goal of that session was and what we feel was accomplished as part of that, and how that kind of sets the table and builds, hopefully, to getting your feedback on some draft language that would be integrated throughout the city code, mostly in the zoning code, but also in the Opportunity Housing Ordinance, Chapter 9, and the Rental Housing Code as well. Technology is always so fun until it doesn't work. Thank you, Mary Cruz. Okay. Oh, see, I knew that was going to happen. Great. So thank you for your patience. So project timeline, just a quick reminder on what we've done so far and where we're going. So we completed the first part of the study session in June and July of this year. We're here this evening at this concurrent meeting on December 17th. If everything goes forward and has consensus of the boards and commissions and the city council, we're going to present this to them in a study session in January. And then if given the green light, we'd likely return to the HRA board in some form, probably seeking a letter of support or some kind of formal acknowledgement of the project, and then go through a typical public hearing process at the Planning Commission and City Council. So that's likely or anticipated to occur in March and April of 2025. So just a refresher on what we did back in June and July. So the purpose of that first study session was really to kind of build more common understanding about what SROs are, single room occupancies or co-living developments. So we provided a few examples. We presented different considerations that might inform kind of regulatory requirements. We talked about how the definition of family and residential occupancy requirements relate to co-living developments. There was general consensus that could be increased or amended for multiple reasons. The potential code amendments would also clarify that co-living is a permitted use in low-density residential dwellings. That's effectively the case today, just through general roommate situations. You rent a house out to 4 unrelated individuals. That is, in effect, some form of co-living. And then we talked about the kind of outline of what a definition of co-living development would look like, and we generally just provided a rough outline of what use standards could look like. So with an acknowledgement that additional work on the Opportunity Housing Ordinance and Rental Housing Code would be needed at a later date. So I'll turn it over to Emily now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Okay. Whoa. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about definitions, some changes that we made in the draft code updates that we gave you. So for the family definition, this is an amendment. We currently have a definition for family, but we would be changing it to basically say that 6 or fewer adults and minor children in their care living together in a dwelling unit make a family. So it's kind of erasing the stuff that says it has to be by blood, marriage, adoption, and we are kind of making it more broader. We did just want to say that this is still a work in progress, so we haven't landed on this definition exactly. We talked to the environmental health staff, and one thing that they said is that this definition needs to be easily enforceable for them, so we are still working on that. Two new definitions that we have are co-living unit and co-living development. So for the co-living unit, the general concepts that we wanted to include for that is that it would consist of a sleeping space, and then it may or may not include bathrooms and kitchens. Otherwise, they would have access to bathrooms and kitchens as common spaces. We also put that they're leased on an individual basis and do not individually constitute a dwelling unit. And then the co-living development is basically just the building or portion of a building that contains the co-living units. The next part kind of goes along with this Venn diagram thing that we have here. So staff is working on cleaning up some definitions related to the congregate living facilities, residential care facilities, boarding houses, and now co-living is kind of coming into this mix. So the issue that we're having is that congregate living has specific use standards that closely relate to residential care. We need to clean this up because we don't want the congregate living standards to apply to co-living, which right now on this diagram would be the closest thing to boarding house, which we would potentially be getting rid of. Okay, so as for the use tables, in previous study sessions, board and commission members made it clear that we should be calling out co-living within single or two-family dwellings, that it is clearly permitted. It already is. We just don't have a use in the table that states that. So rather than have the code be silent on it, we are adding it as a use and making it permitted. As far as the co-living developments go, we made this permitted in districts where multifamily developments are permitted. So that's basically higher density residential zoning districts and then some neighborhood and commercial mixed use zoning districts.
Emily, if I can make one point about this too, is that in our meeting with environmental health, they also suggested allowing co-living within single and two family in the R-1A district. It's not a common district that we interact with very much. There's only 7 of those properties in Bloomington, but in effect, their reasoning was that if you're allowed to have roommates, similar to renting any kind of home, then it should just be permitted in that district too. So we're looking at that. Those houses are on septic systems. That's the reason why that district exists. But likely the final version of the ordinance could include adding it to that district as well.
On to parking requirements. So there would be no changes in parking requirements for co-living within single or two-family dwellings. We already have standards for that, and we wouldn't be changing anything related to that. For co-living developments, staff is recommending the parking requirement be 0.5 spaces per one co-living unit. And staff would not be recommending a required covered parking space. And as far as bike parking goes, we are recommending 1 spot per 4 co-living units, and 90% of which would be long-term.
One thing I'll add on this one is just that the city code currently has a restriction in place on the number of motor vehicles that can be parked outside of a garage at Bloomington residences or properties. This project doesn't currently propose to amend that requirement, but in terms of just how those standards interact with the potential for co-living in a low-density environment, those restrictions are still in place.
As far as the use standards go that we've drafted, basic use standards would be applicable. And then one thing that we have made specifically is for the density calculations. We currently have 3 co-living units would be equal to 1 dwelling. So this would be applicable for minimum and maximum density calculations, and then also open space requirements for multifamily zoning districts. We got this number because we found a similar community that had 4 co-living units equal to 1 dwelling. And then not included in this draft right now is minimum floor areas, common areas, and storage space. Staff isn't recommending storage space requirements, but we will have discussion later about whether to establish minimum floor and common areas.
Okay, on to the Opportunity Housing Ordinance updates. I know this is of interest to the HRA board. So there's some of these incentives that fit well with co-living development and some that do not. Just as a baseline standard or approach to how to integrate this use. So staff would propose that co-living development meet the minimum 9% affordability component at the 60% AMI. It's very possible that at market rate, co-living units might meet that affordability level already. It's something that we likely need to evaluate later when the HRA and Port do their housing analysis later on. That relates to OHO, so that's anticipated to happen in 2025. So one of the questions that we're going to add to that analysis, working with Kenny Niemeyer, is just to try and capture what baseline rents are for co-living or SRO development. There's not a ton of data yet in the Twin Cities region, so it might be a little bit of a difficult ask. But certainly we can get there. But in terms of why to require it, planning staff still feels that there's some positive incentives that can be created to create lower levels of affordability within co-living. So that's just kind of the general premise of why to just integrate it at the standard baseline level at this point. If the housing analysis later reveals that market rents are lower for these types, we certainly can make adjustments later to the Opportunity Housing Ordinance on an ongoing basis. In terms of what incentives that staff is proposing to integrate the co-living into the OHO, would be the site area reduction, site width, open space reduction, exterior materials, landscape fee in lieu of, and the development fee deferment. We're not proposing that co-living be eligible for the parking reduction, and the reason being is that it's proposed to have a lower parking requirement than multifamily. And the enclosed parking provision is not, it would be applicable or something to consider if you require enclosed parking for co-living. But generally speaking, co-living is intended to be at a lower level of or a higher level of affordability. And in addition to that, does tend to have shorter term leases than typical multifamily, more in the 3 to 6 month to 9 month range. So based on those reasons, that's kind of what fueled into that recommendation. We did not include these updates to the rental housing code in this concept version of the code. We anticipate these updates being fairly modest and minimal. Really the issue here is just that the environmental health staff who run the rental housing program need to know what licenses are applicable to co-living and integrate that into the code. So I believe it would be a group living license, but that would be included in the final version of the ordinance. So now on to the more interactive part, and hopefully to get your feedback of kind of where we're hitting the mark or where we're missing the mark here in this first concept. We had in the staff report, we had a series of questions for you to consider, and we'll just kind of walk through them on a series of slides here. Want to get your feedback. One thing I'll say that kind of informs a lot of these standards that we put together is that a lot of the communities that have established co-living or SRO standards tend to be in more dense urban transit-rich areas. So either the standards are hard to find or they're not well relatable to Bloomington's context. And so keep that in mind. And that's why, generally speaking, if some cities, if there was any alignment around a standard like the density thing that Emily mentioned, the 3-to-1 versus 4-to-1, or the parking, as you'll see on this slide, we're trying to tend more towards the conservative side of the range right now because Bloomington is not as dense and does not have as robust of transit service as some of these other cities that do have standards. So I just want to be very frontal about that. So right now we're proposing 0.5 parking spaces per co-living unit. And again, that's kind of on a per bedroom basis, basically. and that is on the conservative side of the range that we've seen. The Alexandria, Virginia, for example, requires 0.25 parking spaces per unit, so 4 units equals 1 parking space. The parking generation manual from Institute of Transportation Engineers for the most comparable use type calls for 0.33 parking spaces per unit. We're proposing 0.5. Just on the left side of this chart here is just for reference what we require for a studio apartment right now in the zoning code, and that's in multifamily dwellings. It's 1.6 parking spaces per unit. Keep in mind, well, never mind, I take that back. So yeah, that's the question kind of for your discussion. How does half parking space per unit, per co-living unit, kind of feel with this group? And we're certainly open to additional adjustments and more research.
I don't know who's Commissioner Curry.
Thanks, Chair. What is the parking requirements by zoning district that we're proposing? R1 versus RS1 versus R4?
Yeah, thank you for that, Chair, Commissioner Curry. So thanks for that question. When we're talking about a general roommate situation, so co-living in a single or two-family dwelling, what we're proposing is that those sites be compliant with the parking requirements for single and two-family homes. And currently what that is 2 spaces per dwelling, one of which is enclosed. Most sites in Bloomington tend to have more parking than that. But that's currently what the zoning code minimum is for those uses. So in effect, if someone were to, under this process, if someone were seeking to formally establish a co-living use, theoretically, we could use the zoning code to do an analysis of the parking to ensure they're meeting the minimums. Yeah, and the issue about the motor vehicles parked outside the dwelling or the not enclosed also is applicable currently, and that's related to nuisance provisions in another section of city code.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Johnson, the requirement around parking outside of garage units, what specifically is that? Is it based on square footage?
No, it's, thank you, Chair Albrecht. So no, it's, I think it's in Chapter 12, but it's in basic nuisance provisions. It's basic code compliance. There's other elements of code compliance for low-density residential properties that are within Chapter 12. And one of the things that they regulate there is just the number of vehicles at a single-family site, basically that are parked outside. And so there's some concern there that an accumulation of motor vehicles at a property does have the possibility of having illegal parking either off a driveway surface or just some other nuisance characteristics.
Apologies. What is the nuisance? What's considered a nuisance? How many cars?
5.
5.
Yeah,
Okay.
so you're allowed to have 4 outside of a garage.
Okay.
Currently.
Thank you.
Commissioner Wooten, I see he's virtual. We do have one commissioner virtual this evening, so Commissioner Wooten, I see your hand up.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question actually goes back to the SRO definition and SRO explanation. How does this SRO policy explanation relate to what the state definition is, and is there a correlation?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, Commissioner Wooten. Thank you for that question. So I would have to know, forgive me if I don't know exactly the definition that you're referring to. HUD does have a definition, I believe, as well. I don't know if the state follows the HUD definition, but generally speaking, I mean, Emily and I have reviewed an assortment of different definitions, and one of the things that maybe is specific to kind of local regulatory environment, one of the things that we're navigating, and the planning manager has been helpful in this regard too, is how to differentiate these uses from multifamily dwellings. And the reason being is that they're just subject to very different standards. Multifamily is subject to more rigorous standards because they're intended to be more permanent forms of housing or longer leases. And so that's one of the challenges that we're navigating, is how to ensure that that this is not some way to do kind of an end around of multifamily standards. So I know I didn't answer your question directly, forgive me, but I certainly can get back to you on that.
I got a follow-up question though.
Sure.
In relation to that, the reason why I'm asking that is because when you think about SROs, normally they are segregated in the sense that they're either by gender or by income or by culture. And my question is, does that get convoluted when you take into effect family or mixed or congregated units, as you're referring to? Does that take that into effect?
Yeah, very Chair Commissioner Wooten. So like definitely a very sticky issue. The developers that I talked to, and it wasn't a large grouping of them, it was a few of them on some of the projects that we've learned about more locally here, but they emphasize very strongly that you have to comply with fair housing law, of course. But one of the challenges is that, of course, residents are going to feel more comfortable in a roommate situation with that close proximity and intimacy of shared space like that. So that's kind of the sticky wicket, or that's the challenge, is how do you, obviously you have to comply with fair housing, and that's critically important, but do so in a way that is also sensitive. My understanding from the developers we talked to is that assigning by gender is still in compliance with fair housing. Other forms is not so. So that's just my early take on it, or my current understanding.
And I got one last question, if I can. So that also leads me to, as you mentioned, something about licensing. And look at that licensing. Are we taking in consideration units that are converted into SROs?
Yeah, Chair Commissioner Wooten. So they would have to maintain a rental license, assuming that it would be a rental unit. So yeah, and they would be inspected on an annual basis. So regardless of conversion, either way, it's going to be inspected if it has a rental license.
Thank you.
Commissioner Issa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question kind of goes back, it's similar to what you asked, but back to this sounds different when it's facing, I gotta get used to that. But you mentioned there's a 5-car parking limit on single-family homes.
Mm-hmm.
Is that on the private driveway, or is that on street parking?
Yeah, Chair Commissioner Issa. So thank you for that question. It would just be on the driveway, on the private property, in effect. So, is this on? Can you hear me okay? Thank you. If you had cars parked on the street, as long as you're abiding by the local parking restrictions, that's okay. It wouldn't count towards your number, is my understanding. So it's cars parked on the private property is what that is subject to, is my understanding.
Okay, so if there's 5 on the private property and, like, let's say 2 on the side street, that would be fine. It wouldn't be 7. It would just be 5.
Yeah, with
Okay.
That's my understanding of the provision. Could certainly send you the language, but it's the maximum is 4, just to clarify. So it's 4 on a private site. Once you exceed 4, then you'd be in violation of that standard. But my understanding is, as long as cars are parked legally on street, they would not be included in that requirement.
Okay, so just to clarify, if it was like, let's say 6 or 5 on the private lot, but it's not interfering with the street, right, the public right away,
Yep.
you would still get fined or something, even though it's not affecting.
That's my understanding currently.
Second question, if you don't mind, Madam Chair.
Go for it.
You mentioned the co-living code was silent previously, I believe. And I just want to clarify here, does silent mean prohibited generally with city code? Or so, because you mentioned it was allowed, but then my understanding of city code is if it's silent, if city code is silent on anything, it's generally prohibited. Is that correct, or is that not true?
Yeah, Chair. Forgive me. No, so good question, and really gets at the heart of a lot of zoning matters. That zoning codes and city codes in generally are not permissive tools, right? If it doesn't explicitly allow something, then it tends to be prohibited. The one reason why this is different is that renting a single-family dwelling is explicitly allowed, subject to occupancy standards. So it just doesn't get into the nitty-gritty specifics about roommate rental situations. So it is allowed today. This project does not propose to change it. It's just from an actual defined use. If you wanted to subject these sites to any additional standards related to this arrangement, you would have to define it as a separate use in effect. So that's kind of it's that and just making sure that it's explicitly permitted, because it's more in the definition of family and then in the rental housing provisions. So you have to kind of draw a convoluted line to see how it's allowed, but it's allowed. Yeah, today.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead, Commissioner. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Planner Johnson, I see up on the screen that it's 1.6 parking spaces per studio apartment. Is that for every dwelling unit in a multifamily across the board? It's 1.6, or does the per bedroom ratio come down as you get to, say, a 2 or 3 bedroom dwelling?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Cunningham. Do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure.
Sorry.
Chair, Commissioner Cunningham, as the amount of bedrooms go up, so like for a 2 or 3 bedroom, the amount of parking spaces does go down. I can't remember exactly what the numbers are. I think Nick is maybe looking at it.
Commissioner Cookton has them on his iPad. Always prepared. Okay, so as we approach a 3-bedroom dwelling unit, the city code, I'm sorry if I stole your question, Commissioner Cookton, is essentially 1-to-1. So a 3-bedroom is 3 spaces per dwelling unit. A 4-bedroom is 3.4 spaces per dwelling unit. So
no, not for multifamily.
Oh, I'm looking at townhouse. I am so sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So efficiency and 1 bedroom is 1.6 per unit, and then 2 bedroom and above is 2.0 per unit currently.
Got it. Thank you, Planning Manager Markegard. So, for example, if a co-living unit as proposed had 4 different co-living units within a dwelling, they would have the same parking requirement as a 4-bedroom multifamily unit. If it's 2 and above, is 2.0.
That's effectively correct, yeah. And so one of the thing just in general about discussion around multifamily parking requirements is with the incentives built into the OHO, and then historically before the OHO, there was quite a significant amount of flexibility that was approved on a per project basis. And so now a lot of those incentives are built in with the opportunity housing ordinance. So one thing to note about, looking at this chart, it can be somewhat misleading or, like, wow, that's a significantly higher parking requirement. And on its face, it is. But just to note that on a larger project, those reductions that come through the OHO can be fairly significant, 20, 30%, depending on the level of affordability. So that's something that we're not proposing to include for co-living, but just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind that rarely does a multifamily project in Bloomington just meet the base standard of our multifamily parking requirement because of OHO, because of other opportunities to reduce the parking requirement. Mike Palermo actually wrote these most latest version rules, and I think it was most done in 2019. Is that right? Yep. Yeah. So
You are correct.
With the complexity of incentives and things like that, rarely is it the baseline, and it's something to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Other thoughts on any of the questions on the screen?
Commissioner Mua.
Thank you, Chair. I'm thinking through this, and like you said, with the OHO, there's opportunity to reduce parking. So if we already go at a half per proposed unit, and they qualify for OHO, and they do the parking incentive, that essentially drives it down even more. I guess my concern is, like, would there be sufficient parking given the increased number of units, and then taking advantage of the OHO parking reduction as well? Would that cause issues for neighborhoods, for streets, that kind of thing?
Yeah, Chair Commissioner Mua. So thanks for the question. And just to clarify, at this point, we're not proposing to have the OHO incentive apply to co-living, just to clarify that. And we're talking about the larger scale or the larger context co-living. So just on that point. But I mean, yeah, I think, one of the comfort zones we have with multifamily is we have many, many projects to point to where we have lots of examples of what we're seeing, what the development community is wanting to build, how does that match up with our requirements? Right now, in this co-living space, in the Bloomington context, it's a lot of kind of speculation at this point. We can look at lots of different standards all over the country, and we specifically selected and researched cities that are more suburban in nature, but outside, within regions that have more co-living or SRO development. And so that gives us a little bit of, better alignment or more comfort. But I mean, frankly, this is something that you likely need to kind of track really closely as you develop your first couple co-living projects and see how it's functioning. And the parking requirement may need to be adjusted in either direction. And some of it might be locational specific. It might relate to a potential rezoning request for a site. Is there on-street parking available in the area? What other potential conflicts might exist with collector, high volume, arterial roadways nearby? So that tend to have parking restrictions. So it's a little bit of, I don't want to use the term speculation or guesswork, but it's more like this is our best educated guess for what we think would make sense in a Bloomington context right now. But it does need to be tested in the real world.
Commissioner Curry.
Thanks, Chair. I guess kind of the question is then why do we need to create a parking requirement if we're basically modeling what the existing zoning is? Like, sounds like additional work that just complicates kind of the governance process and all the things the city already has to do.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Chair Commissioner Curry. So why create a co-living use separate from multifamily effectively?
No, why create a specific parking requirement in addition to what the city already has?
Yep. Okay.
If the specific parking requirement already for that zone is already works.
Are you referring to the single family or the higher density version?
I guess specifically R1 or RS1 and R4. Because, I mean, how would the city even monitor that?
Yeah. No, thank you for this clarifying question. So the 0.5 parking spaces per unit would not be applicable to the low density setting. It's a standard that's being developed and adopted only for the higher density kind of form that this development can take place in. And just to continue that thread one, so if that was not clear, my apologies, but the other point is that why create a separate parking standard in general? One is just that the use characteristics are different. There tends to be lower motor vehicle ownership rates among residents of co-living. In addition to that is the enclosed parking requirement. And that's something that the city's gotten feedback about in the past. It costs a lot of money to build one enclosed parking stall per unit. And it's obviously a very valuable amenity, especially in Minnesota with pretty harsh weather. But it comes at a cost. And so if one of the goals of this development type is to try and seek and maintain higher levels of affordability, that's one of the things that we would suggest removing as a required component of this development type.
Thank you.
I just have a comment. The parking requirement for co-living as proposed seems very reasonable. I don't think it's too high or too low. But in conjunction with bicycle parking, it seems like if you're pulling at one lever, you should be kind of letting another go. And maybe a good way to do that would be to offer incentives, maybe through the Opportunity Housing Ordinance, for more bicycle parking or indoor bicycle parking versus outdoor bicycle parking to incentivize almost that would be a top priority for the developer who's looking at this type of unit. I don't know what the absorption per se of bicycle parking that we have in multifamily as of right now and whether it's indoor or outdoor, but it seems as though if we're lowering the parking, we might as well increase the amenities for bicycle parking. Perspective. Commissioner Issa.
Yeah, I agree with you, Madam Chair, on that one. I was going to ask a quick question. What is the relevance in that Venn diagram bubble chart thing of residential care facilities? Like, what is the correlation there? Because I was confused there. But yeah, if you clarify that, thank you.
Yeah, Chair Commissioner Issa. So residential care facilities it's a use that we have in our code that falls within the congregate living facilities. And typically we think of residential care facilities as being somewhere where people are going to receive care. And so we have specific call-outs in our code for like the number of people you can have there and where, like what zoning districts they can be in. And so I guess what we're trying to point out with this circle thing is that we have a lot of overlapping definitions, and co-living is potentially going to fall within this. And so now that we're trying to figure out co-living, we also kind of want to unravel these other definitions and make sure that, for example, we're not saying to be a co-living development, you have to follow the use standards for congregate living, which may include like requiring care or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add a little bit to that, is that this is one of the more complex use definitional situations I've encountered in my planning career, in so much as a lot of cities seem to develop a lot of different type of group living uses because they align with either various state licenses or kind of what building code or housing code define as these different uses. And right now, as it's developed in Bloomington, per Emily's point, is that the standards for congregate living, even though if you read the definition and it very much aligns with what an SRO is, basically, the standards for it in our code align more with residential facilities that provide care, that have staff, that have that take care of people, in effect. So we kind of have to separate those two things out, and it's just going to take a little bit of work to untangle that. It's a very much in the weeds, our problem to solve thing. But yeah, it's kind of a pain.
Well, that makes total sense. Thank you, guys.
Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Hesbeck, would a developer or owner of this type of facility be able to charge for a parking spot?
Chair, Commissioner Cookton, that's a good question. You want to take a crack at that, Nick?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
Mr. Johnson, would a developer or whoever owns this facility ultimately be able to charge for a parking spot?
It's a good question. If they were not subject to the incentives in the OHO, I believe they would, per city code. So that may be one reason to explore that, just from a cost control perspective. Obviously, if there was a city, some form of city subsidy in the project, that probably could be a condition of the development agreement that they not do so. If they were requiring minimum levels of affordability. But just as the city code sits today, that language prohibiting that arrangement is tied to the incentive of the parking reduction. And so if co-living is not eligible for the parking reduction, you'd likely have to create some other pathway to do that.
Madam Chair, I think we're a little low at 0.5. And one of my concerns is that if we have 6 units and there's only 4 parking spots, you're either going to have an equity problem where some people are getting it, but their neighbor doesn't. And why is that? I'm not sure. Or they're going to start charging for it, which I think is the more likely scenario. If you have less parking spots than the number of units, you're going to charge for that parking spot. And now you're sort of undoing the good we're trying to do by creating affordable housing. So I think I would be more comfortable at 1.0 than 0.5.
Commissioner Curry.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Cookton. I think it would be, it'd be safer to start with a higher number and go down rather than end up with developments that you cannot undo a lower, parking, too little parking provided. I'm just trying to think of, you couldn't, unless you could figure out a way to, offer some sort of like proof of parking which you sometimes do more in commercial development, where they would have the opportunity to expand the parking in the future. But it seems to me that it would just be safer to be on the high side and see what kind of pushback you get from the community as to whether it's not feasible to develop a co-living development in the first place.
Commissioner Cookton.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I forgot to add as to why I think we're a little low is my other concern is that our most transit developed areas of the city, I think, are some of the less likely places we're going to see this type of development. I'm kind of thinking, where could I live in Bloomington and not own a car? Well, I could live at Bloomington Central Station. I don't think we're going to see these there. I could live at Penn and American. Not sure we're going to see these there. Normandale Lake, maybe. I don't think we're going to see these there. So, okay, maybe around 98th and Lindale or something, but we're just not, in the context of being able to live in a place without a car, we're nowhere near as advanced as Minneapolis is. And I think the areas where we are able to live without a car in Bloomington, I'm not sure those are the places we would see this type of development.
Thank you for your feedback. One thing I would mention that relates to that to a degree is the if the city were to establish a higher parking requirement, then it may make more sense to then make a development eligible for the parking reduction offered in the OHO. The only thing to be cognizant of that is, again, the 20 unit cutoff, but in a co-living setting, it's pretty easy to get to 20. But yeah, so just a thought there. Should we keep going? We'll see if this thing works again here. All right. Did I go too far? No. So one thing that our multifamily standards have that we did not include in this draft, and kind of just getting your quick feedback on, is we have design standards. Maybe Glenn can speak to how often we've actually had to enforce these or utilize these standards, but we have minimum requirements around blank facades. If there's multiple buildings on a site, they have to be architecturally compatible. You have to hide exterior air conditioners, that kind of thing. Most architects, as well as just minimum building code requirements, have enough articulation and windows and things on it that break up the facade of a building. But these are standards currently in our multifamily, and so we did not include them in the draft. They could be applicable to higher density co-living developments as well. So I just wanted to get people's feedback about that, or if there was some other form of design standards we should be considering. And that's kind of small text there, so forgive me. I see some people squinting, trying to read that. But basically, blank facades, multiple buildings on a site, air conditioners. This is something we could easily integrate into the use standards for this use, but just seeking your feedback on it.
I have just a quick thought that these standards seem to be just sort of a good neighbor, was my initial thought. So I tend to lean towards including those standards in co-living developments as well, or maybe over a certain number of units, you kick in the multifamily dwelling design standards, but under a certain number of units, maybe it's a little more lenient, would be my thought. Commissioner Issa?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think after reading the highlighted lines, I think that it should not be, because let's say, for example, I think it's the second one, the middle one, multi-buildings section, if the developer did want to have multi-buildings on one lot or whatever, I don't think the developer that's developing this SRO should be prohibited. And then as far as air conditioning, like, I'm not a developer or anything, but I think most of them are central air conditioning nowadays, so I don't think it will get that like bulky, like if a developer did want to build this anyways. But that's kind of my initial thoughts. So overall, I believe that initially my thoughts are to have co-living developments not subject to design standards that multifamily residential buildings are.
Commissioner Moore.
Thank you, Chair. My initial thoughts that I would like to see design standards equivalent. I think especially with the OHO, what we've been trying to do with affordable housing, especially larger scale development, is to ensure that A, it's spread out throughout the city, and B, it doesn't stand out. That we're mixed into neighborhoods that no one can look at your unit and say, oh, you're at this building, and we know what that connotation means, right? And so not having that allows, A, yes, it does support developers, makes it cheaper, but also it goes against what I think our initial thought was with our affordable housing plans, is to make sure that we're spreading it out throughout the city and that it looks and feels and the community is set up the same way so that no one feels in particular like they're being singled out. And I think that's the purpose of SROs and co-living, is to allow you the opportunity to grow and move it through the housing continuum without having those additional challenges that something like not having residential standards set up could potentially bring out.
I would like to piggyback off of that and say I 100% agree, especially in the fact that, you know, that was a big key thing with the OHO, is us making sure that it was equitable, and we were making it equitable, and not cutting on looks and feels and designs. Just because it was affordable doesn't mean it shouldn't be kept to the same standards. So I'm very much supportive of keeping that for this as well.
Commissioner Cookton, I believe I saw your hand.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with the previous couple comments, but I am not a fan of letter B here. That is language that's similar to what we have in our plan development part of our code, and I don't like that there, and I don't like it here. What I have found is that that ends up backfiring on us as we go further down the line. So we have that at the 98th and Lindale Shopping Center with Festival. And what ends up happening is, okay, so that was all built and they all look the same. And then 20 years down the road, a new development wants to come in and they're stuck following 20-year-old design standards. So that Bank of America has to be done out of brick instead of a nice glass facade like they wanted to do. So I am not a fan of making buildings look the same. I think then you're stuck with design standards that are, in some cases, decades old.
Commissioner Issa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do understand where Commissioner Mua and Chair of the HRA board, sorry, I didn't get your name, but is coming from. But me personally, I grew up in low-income housing in the city of Bloomington, and my thoughts on that are, you know, I guess a question for all of us to think about is, what if these, do we prioritize the looks of an area or looking cheaper than another part of the city or another development versus what if it's just more affordable for both the developer and then onto the resident, you know, but it still does maybe look a little bit different or stands out. What do we prioritize more, you know? Because me personally, I would rather have something more affordable, having a space more affordable, than someone being like, hey, there goes that low income or the hood over there, whatever, you know what I mean? So, yeah, that's my thoughts.
Thanks for the feedback. I mean, I think the general good news in all of the projects that we've reviewed in the last 5 or more years is that this rarely has been an issue. Thankfully, most of the architects working on projects in Bloomington are bringing a pretty favorable product and things that the city can be proud of. So, but I appreciate the feedback, and we'll try and square that in our version that goes to a public hearing, and we'll seek city council feedback on this as well later in the month. Next question for discussion, Emily. Take it away.
So our next question is, should use standards include minimum floor area per unit? So staff has seen ranges between 70 square feet and 250 square feet. So in this example that's shown, it's from St. Paul, and they have a unit that includes a bathroom that is 192 square feet. So one of the benefits of this, of potentially creating a maximum floor area per unit, is that it's going to differentiate between multifamily units and uses. The minimum floor area of an efficiency unit here is 400 square feet. So we're trying to keep these smaller and affordable, all the other benefits that come from that.
The only thing I might add to that, Emily, thanks, is that it's my understanding that the building code typically requires 70 square feet as the minimum for a single occupant. And so one of the arguments to establish a slightly higher minimum than that is that you're paving the way to allow multiple people to legally occupy that space. So you don't kind of get into that conundrum where, maybe a single occupant rents that space for the first lease, but the second lease has, two people. And then it just kind of becomes a chasing our tail kind of thing. So that's one of the things we're thinking about with respect to establishing a minimum unit size for co-living. And if that were the case, I think it'd be 120, I want to say, 110 or 120.
Commissioner Cunningham. Oh, sorry.
Senior planner? Planning Supervisor Johnson has answered my question on the. I was going to bring up. I know in commercial building settings for bathrooms, closets, things like that, if you're sprinkling the building with fire sprinklers, if you're under 70 square feet, you typically can get an exemption, depending on the use of the building. And I'm trying not to play stump the planner here. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I was going to ask, since these are considered bedrooms, no matter the size of the bedroom, they would, if sprinkler was required for the size or occupancy of the building, then the bedroom would need a sprinkler head regardless of the floor area, correct?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So Commissioner Cunningham, my understanding is that any of this form of development outside of a single or two family dwelling is going to require sprinklers, typical to any higher level of residential occupancy. So I think it goes without saying that these are all going to be sprinkled, but for a roommate situation in a single family home.
Thank you.
Commissioner Curry, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Has there been I'm trying to think, has there been a number proposed at all? I mean, I definitely see a need for potentially having a larger minimum than what we've got for multifamily, just again, kind of because of what you've outlined, but to what extent should that be higher?
Yeah, Commissioner Curry, so larger minimum than multifamily? So
Yeah.
For reference, multifamily has, we can certainly pull up those standards as well. I think it's 400 square feet for an efficiency unit, and then it kind of gradually goes up as you do 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom. And we can get those standards here in a moment. But generally speaking, all of these co-living units or these sleeping spaces, bedrooms, whatever you want to refer to them as, tend to be smaller than an efficiency apartment because it typically does not include much of that common space serving the unit.
And I was thinking about it on a per unit more in the traditional multifamily sense rather than on a per unit like individual living like bedroom.
Okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah. So one of the things we've been thinking a little bit about is effectively in this example here on the screen, and this is the upper level of a 6-unit one, actually. But effectively, what some of these standards can result in is capping the amount of units that is contained within a single pod. So if you're thinking about like a dormitory or a traditional boarding house, you could have as many as, say, 20 units all sharing a common space. And Emily will present a slide about minimum common space per unit. That's another standard we're thinking about. But effectively, we're not proposing to cap the number of units that are sharing a pod or a kitchen, if that makes sense. We haven't seen cities do that. It tends to kind of work itself out just with the market, and if you can't have too many units sharing a kitchen because then you'd never be able to use your cooking facilities, right? It would just be too much demand. But yeah, that's an interesting idea. We haven't looked at that.
Commissioner Isa.
Yeah, so looking at this, I'm kind of thinking along the same lines of what Commissioner Issa mentioned, which is with shared or co-living, it kind of appeals to a specific niche of people who may not be able to live in your typical apartment or typical multiple family setting. So I think with that, I don't have a specific number in mind. I'd also be interested in hearing what number could be thrown out there, but I think it's important to keep in mind that good is better than perfect. So while I would love to see kind of going along the same lines of the design that, you know, everything is homogenous and people don't feel the sense of, oh, that's a low income area. I think with that, and also with the minimum square footage, people really just need affordable housing. And I think most people will prefer costs being lower in any shape or form, obviously within reason, over perfection. So I think with this, we can kind of take a slightly different approach with the requirements that we have with our other type of settings.
Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Johnson, do we have a minimum size for hotel rooms?
We do not. Forgive me, chairs. Commissioner Cookton, we don't have a minimum size of a hotel room, but they are also subject to building and fire code I forget the name of the use that it is in the building and fire code, but it's subject to minimum square footage requirements. So it's not in the zoning code, but effectively it is governed by the building and housing code. Yes.
If I may.
Go for it.
If I recall, we do have dorm rooms in our code. Is there a minimum size for dorm rooms?
There's not. So again, it would be governed by building and fire code. Yeah. And just for, to be clear, I didn't explicitly say this. We haven't included this in the draft. We wanted to get your feedback before we went there. But if the city were to move in this direction, and I appreciated your comments, Commissioner Issei, but I think what we would be looking at most likely, just from a staff recommendation, is probably having a minimum size adequate to have 2 occupants, because I just think that that's the most effective just in terms of managing the occupancy of the development. And so that likely would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 120, 110, but we need to do a little bit more research and confirm that.
I'll jump in. Quick Google search, so take it with a grain of salt, but looks like occupancy requirements are 70 square feet per one person or one bedroom, so that's the minimum, but 60 square feet for usable floor space for each occupant, so for hotels, and give you an idea. So in line with 2 people would be 120 square feet.
Thanks, Mike.
Commissioner Mua.
Thank you, Chair. My initial thoughts on it is just flexibility. So like the lowest possible, and then allow the market and the developers to figure out what size they need. Even if it was at 70 square feet and they decided that was what they wanted to do and no one wanted to rent them, they could knock down a wall and have 140 square feet. But that's up to them and the market to decide. So I'd like to see more flexibility in that.
I tend to agree with that too, is not including a minimum floor area and seeing what the market will bear. I think we have a lot more questions than answers in co-living, and letting the market kind of dictate what happens. I think at least to start is a good start.
All right, good feedback. Thank you all.
Last question, similar to the last one. Should use standards include a minimum common space per unit? So this is asking, should there be like a minimum square footage for like the kitchen and bathrooms, if those are going to be shared, and whatever common living space there might also be. Some of the positives for this is that it would, require an amount of space. You could potentially have good amenities and good common space there. And some of the negatives are that it would just, by having more common space, you're decreasing the amount of bedrooms and unit creation.
Yeah, I would add that there's this, unlike the minimum unit sizes and max unit sizes, this is, we've seen this in the cities that we've studied, we see this one less frequently. I think only on 1 or 2 occasions. So I think right now, just from a regulatory standpoint, this might be more aligned with kind of letting the market do what the market does. But we wanted to bring it up just for the opportunity of A, providing minimum amenities for residents on a per unit basis, and B, acknowledging that there's probably a relationship between the density and the amount of units that can be created and the requiring shared common space. The higher you set that, the less, the more costly it's going to be on a per unit basis.
Commissioner Cook, Commissioner Issa.
Thank you, Chair. I would actually, same answer you guys gave for the previous one. I would say to let the market kind of dictate this. I think having more restrictions early on initially is not good. So yeah.
Commissioner Cookton.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Normally, I'm a let the market do what it wants to do guy, but the market is out to make a profit. And like the market right now isn't building this type of housing because it's not maximizing profit. And so if we're just going to let the market do what the market wants to do, it's going to be the smallest of everything, making the most just barely scrape by for the tenant, because I think that's the goal of the market. Or you're going to get really expensive stuff, which is what our market is doing right now. And so like I think of our role in this is trying to help the people who need a little assistance right now. And so if we as a government can say, we're not going to let the developer maximize profit here. We're going to have them take a little bit less to improve the experience for the user. That's what I would prefer in this case. Market rate housing, I'm all for it. We have a lot of it. We're going to keep doing it. In this case, where we're trying to help people who need some assistance as they do, I'm in favor of us having some minimum standards on both the last question and this question.
I hear that, and I understand the want for a certain amount of minimum common space. However, I think it does increase the cost to actually build, which is then passed on to the resident. So you could anticipate a higher rent, and I'm foreseeing there could be people who are not interested in cooking at all, and therefore they don't want access to the kitchen and they don't care at all. So I would just lean towards letting it be what the market will bear, and then based on what the needs are of the people who are living there, then that can be met. But I'm curious about, so the common space, does that include bathrooms?
Chair, it could. Potentially, the bathrooms could be in each unit, or they could be like shared.
So I would think if they are shared and it's considered common space, I think there should be a requirement of number of restroom stalls or facilities or whatever it happens to be per bedroom. But I don't think necessarily the rest of it needs to be dictated by minimum common space.
Yeah, Chair, I should have maybe clarified too at the beginning that informs this conversation a little bit, is that the building code does have some minimum requirements for cooking and bathroom facilities as well. So that would inform some of this at a bare minimum, because you have to comply with building code.
Commissioner Isai.
Yeah, I would second that. I think if it's already potentially a challenge to be able to develop or have developers create co-living developments, it's only going to be more of a challenge if you create more restrictive language. And so what I think in reality that would end up happening is that these developers would say, well, this is just too much. I'd rather just build a regular apartment. And then what ends up happening is you actually just entirely miss out on that co-living space. And so I kind of am more open to what you were kind of mentioning.
Commissioner Mueller.
I'm curious what public health would say about what might be minimum, at least, bare minimum size for common spaces. Because I'm guessing they would have some idea, some recommendation. You get certain amount of people together, and this amount, it's no longer a healthy situation, or the potential is there for it to become an unhealthy situation. So I wonder if they have any input or what they would say.
Yeah, Chair, Commissioner Mueller, thanks for that suggestion. We can follow up with public health staff. Okay to proceed?
Okay. So the next steps are that we are planning on going to a study session with council in late January, and then public hearings could be as early as March and April.
If I can add one thing to that, so traditionally for some of these planning commission work plan projects or zoning projects that do have that do intersect strongly with housing policy, sometimes what we've done is come before the HRA board for seeking a letter of support or guidance more formally. So I would say that we're planning to do that, and if that's okay with you all, and we certainly can coordinate with Sarah and the HRA staff on setting a good meeting date to present that for you for your consideration.
That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you for your feedback.
Any last questions about this?
Just a quick question. Do you guys anticipate kind of another meeting similar to this after the end of that kind of date graph that you guys had? So
in terms of a concurrent meeting,
yeah.
Not for this specific item, but I think generally that's good feedback to get, that if this is a format that the boards like to share space and share ideas, I think it benefits both, and we as staff can work to coordinate that. Of course, there's always the challenging of scheduling, getting everyone in the room at the same time. Probably hard during the summer months, is my guess, but we'll take that feedback and think about which projects might be a good fit for that.
Commissioner Wooten has a question.
My question is on the letter of support. When are you anticipating needing to have something like that?
Yeah, Chair, thank you, Commissioner Wooten. I would guess in March of 2025, probably along shortly before or on a parallel track to the Planning Commission public hearing would be my guess.
Okay, and is there a possible framework for what that letter of support needs to say in regards to what our role is?
We can certainly think about that. I think it's just more along the lines of in support of affordable housing and the continuum of housing as directed by the Bloomington Comprehensive Plan's housing element and other policies of the city and HRA. We certainly can coordinate on what that would look like, but if you have suggestions, we happily accept them.
Well, just for clarification, I want to make sure if it needs to include something specific to SROs, that we have a framework for understanding what that.
No, thank you. I don't think so. I think it's more just it's more for the Planning Commission and City Council's benefit to know where the HRA board stands, and because obviously this is giving you all different tools in your toolbox to approach your work. So I think it's more so just kind of being on the record.
Thank you.
I'll also just add, Chair and Commissioners, that a letter of support from the HRA board is something that we would draft and bring to the HRA board for approval. So at that time, we could also look at what's drafted and consider any changes or adjustments that need made at that time.
Commissioner Mueller and then Commissioner Mullah.
I'm sorry if this repeats something that was said or in months earlier discussions. Is this a preemptive setting up these standards, or have there been inquiries into SRO housing for the city of Bloomington?
Yeah, Chair, Commissioner Mueller, thank you. So we have not gotten recent inquiries on the higher scale type of development. We have, environmental health probably can count on one hand the number of roommate rentals that we have in the city, so that does exist. So I think it's more preemptive move. I would say that this use type is starting to be developed in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I still think we're on the early edge of this in this region, but it's probably good to get some baseline rules in order. And I mean, I'll share again what one of the developers I spoke with said is if you can just reevaluate your family or occupancy definition, that alone is a very significant policy move, because a lot of cities have not evaluated that kind of key ingredient or component of their regulations in a long time. So kudos to St. Paul for doing so recently in 2020.
Thank you.
Commissioner Mullah.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just assuming you're going to come back to the HRA to do a final presentation before the public hearings to get the letter of support. Not just seeking letter of support, but updating everyone with the presentation, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for that question.
Are there any other questions? Okay, seeing no other questions, for the HRA, the meeting is adjourned.
Apologies, Chair. If I may, we do have a second item on the
Oh,
agenda
I
as presented. It is a study item. No, that's okay. It's a general discussion, open opportunity for commissioners to share thoughts and ask questions. I don't know, Mr. Markergard, if you have any additional information.
Sorry. I apologize.
Madam Chair, the purpose of the second item is just an open-ended item to provide an opportunity. If the HRA and Planning Commission want to bring up any issues related to housing and discuss them, it could be things like opportunities or challenges or innovations that you're seeing in other communities, things of that nature. As long as it's within the context of housing, anything would be open for discussion.
Looking for any discussion points.
I will throw one thing out there that I know we've met about years ago, and that was the cluster housing. And you all look at me because this is something I've really been into. And I think of that too with the co-living a little bit, having like one main facility with the cooking and whatever, and then have small cluster houses around. I see this really taking off. I know of many organizations that are building them, the tiny houses and things like that. And I know there's projects in Minneapolis. So just kind of something to throw out there to make sure that conversation continues, because I do think we have some lot properties and sizes that could to hold these type of developments.
Yeah, Madam Chair, just to respond briefly to that, it's definitely something that staff is looking into, specifically in the context of missing middle housing. Thinking of it in terms of cottage courts or detached townhomes, different ways that we could accommodate that style of development.
Thank you. Any other discussion items? Commissioner Moore.
Thank you, Chair. I guess the thing I'm most interested in is the state has committed a lot of time and resources to missing middle, and I just want to make sure. I know staff is doing it, and I appreciate all the work that you do, but I just want to make sure that we are fully taking advantage of every opportunity, every resource, every fund that we can get into, every grant, to help continue to drive this. I know last week we just had conversations with the Port Authority on LAHA money, and so everything we can do to ensure that Bloomington continues to stay on the leading end of it instead of the trailing end is something I'm particularly interested, especially in the HRA.
All right. Seeing none, I guess I will close out the December 17th meeting of the Bloomington Planning Commission.
And I will adjourn the Tuesday, December 17th, 2024 Housing and Redevelopment Authority meeting.